10 minutes past 7 on a black November evening, and the largest freighter on the Great Lakes was still riding the storm, her master steady on the radio, telling the ship behind him that he was holding his own. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from her. Before the vessel trailing behind could answer, the green mark that was 729 feet of steel and 29 living men slid off the radar screen and did not come back. No distress call came, no flare rose, no lifeboat pulled away. When the lake was searched for her crew, not one body was ever found, only broken boats and the silence of a giant swallowed whole in the time it takes to draw a breath. She lies now in 2 shattered pieces, 530 feet down, and still no one can say for certain what killed her. If the great ships and the storms that took them pull at you, subscribe and stay to the end, because what really sank the Edmund Fitzgerald is not the simple story most people were told. Every sailor on the inland seas knows the month of November the way a soldier knows a bad stretch of road and knows what waits there. The Great Lakes are not lakes in the ordinary sense. They are inland freshwater seas, wide enough that a ship in the middle of one cannot see any shore, deep enough and cold enough to keep their dead. And of the 5, Lake Superior is the coldest, the deepest, and the least forgiving. It holds more water than all the others combined. In its worst moods, it can raise seas as steep and as vicious as any ocean, and it does its worst in the autumn, when the warm water left over from summer meets the first killing air out of Canada. Sailors gave the eastern end of the lake a grim name, the graveyard of the Great Lakes, and they had earned the right to it. In the stretch of water around Whitefish Point, the very corner the Fitzgerald would spend her last hours trying to reach, better than 240 ships had been lost across the century and a half before her. The lake keeps what it takes. Its water stays so cold, only a few degrees above freezing in the depths, even in the heat of summer, that a man who goes into it does not last long, and a body does not always rise the way it might in a warmer sea. Superior does not readily give up its dead. Every lakeman knew it, and every lakeman carried the knowledge quietly, the way people carry the odds of a dangerous trade. The lakemen have an old phrase for the season, worn smooth by a century of use: the gales of November. In those weeks, the storms come down off the plains and cross the lakes with a speed and a fury that ships built for calm summer hauling are barely made to survive. Sailors watched the calendar the way farmers watch the sky. The oar had to move before the ice closed the harbours, and so the biggest freighters ran late into the year, loading iron in the cold and driving it south while the weather turned against them a little more with every trip. It was a gamble every autumn, and most autumns the ships won. On the 8th of November, 1975, a low-pressure system was gathering far to the south and west, down over the plains of Oklahoma. On a weather map, it was nothing much yet, a swirl of falling pressure 1,000 miles from the lake. But it was deepening as it came, feeding on the clash of cold and warm air, and it was tracking north and east on a path that would carry it across the middle of the country and straight over the inland seas. The men whose business was the weather saw it coming. What they could not agree on was where it would go. The first forecasts were almost reassuring. The National Weather Service expected the storm to pass south of Lake Superior, to skirt the bottom of the lake and spare the open water the worst of it. A captain reading that forecast on the 9th of November had reason to believe he could make his run before the weather closed in, that the storm would stay politely to one side while he crossed. It was a fair reading of the information at hand. It was also wrong, and the error was not small. The storm would not pass to the south. It would climb directly up the length of Lake Superior, dragging near hurricane winds across the exact water where the oar boats ran. There was one man on the lake that day who did not trust the forecast at all. Captain Dudley Paquette, master of the freighter Wilfred Sykes, had been watching the same low since it was still over Oklahoma, and everything in his experience told him it was going to cross the lake and cross it hard. He plotted a course that hugged the protected north shore, tucked under the land where the highest seas could not build, and when the worst of it came, he took his ship into the shelter of a bay and waited it out. His judgment would prove exactly right, but Paquette was the exception. Most of the fleet read the milder forecast, chose the usual open water route, and trusted the lake to behave the way the map said it would. Into that gap between the forecast and the truth steamed the pride of the American side. She was the biggest carrier on the lakes, commanded by one of the most respected heavy weather captains afloat, loaded with a full cargo of iron and bound for the mills near Detroit. Her master had crossed Superior in November more times than he could count. He knew the gales, and he had never much feared them. The storm building to the southwest was, to a man like him, simply the price of the season, one more November blow to be driven through on the way to port. Nothing about the evening of the 9th of November looked like the last night of anything. The ship was sound, the captain was able, the cargo was ordinary, and the storm, for now, was only a smear of low pressure a long way off, no more threatening on paper than 100 others he had beaten. That was the cruelty waiting in the days ahead. The disaster that was coming did not announce itself. It gathered quietly, in a forecast that put the danger in the wrong place, and it let the finest ship on the lake sail out to meet it, thinking she had all the room in the world. When she slid sideways into the water in front of 15,000 people, she was the biggest thing that moved on fresh water anywhere on Earth. It was the 7th of June, 1958, at a shipyard on the Michigan side of the Detroit River, and the crowd had come to watch a record take to the water. 729 feet from bow to stern, 75 feet across, 13,000 tons of empty steel before she carried a single pound of cargo. There was no ship on the Great Lakes to touch her. The newspapers reached for the only comparison big enough and called her the Queen of the Lakes. She had been built the way an insurance company buys a bond. A great firm from Milwaukee had paid the $7 million she cost, a sum worth something near $60 million in the money of today, and it was the first time an American life insurance company had ever put its money into a ship. She was leased out to be run by a shipping fleet from Cleveland, on a contract meant to last 25 years, and she was made the flagship of that fleet, the finest and largest vessel on its books. Her owners named her after the man who ran the insurance company, Edmund Fitzgerald, who by all accounts tried to talk them out of putting his name on her and was voted down. To the men who sailed her and the crowds who watched her pass, she was simply the Fitz, the Mighty Fitz, the pride of the American side. She earned the pride. 6 separate times she set the record for the most iron carried down the lakes in a single season, and more than once the record she broke was her own. On one run, she carried better than 27,000 tons in a single load. Over 17 years, she made an estimated 748 round trips and covered more than 1 million miles, a distance that would carry a ship around the world some 44 times. She was not a pretty little pleasure boat. She was a working giant, and she worked harder and carried more than anything else on the water. Set the numbers beside one another, and the scale of her comes clear. 729 feet of hull, longer than 2.5 football fields laid end to end. 13,000 tons of steel before she loaded a single pellet, and better than 26,000 tons of iron ore poured into her on a full run. It took the better part of half a day to fill her, and most of a day to empty her again, and she did it trip after trip for 17 years, a floating iron mountain that paid for herself many times over. When men on shore saw her pass, low and vast and seemingly endless, they stopped what they were doing to watch her go by. There was nothing else on fresh water like her. Below decks, she was, by the rough standards of an oar boat, almost luxurious. There were carpeted rooms and tiled bathrooms, 2 staterooms kept for guests, leather chairs in the lounge, air conditioning in the crew quarters, a pilot house packed with the best navigation equipment money could buy. Owners and important guests were sometimes carried on her runs, and they were carried in comfort. She was a showpiece as much as a workhorse, a thing her owners were proud to be seen to own. But a documentary about her death has to look past the carpet and the leather, because the things that would kill her were built into her the same year she was launched, and they were hidden in plain sight. Consider first her deck. Along the top of her ran 21 great cargo hatches, each one a rectangular opening 11 feet wide and 48 feet long, and each was closed by a single heavy steel cover lowered into place and held down by clamps that a crewman swung shut by hand. Those covers were watertight only if every clamp was actually fastened, and fastening them all was slow, cold work. Remember the hatches. They sit at the very center of the argument over how she died. Consider next what lay beneath those hatches. Her enormous cargo hold was very nearly one single space, running most of the length of the ship, broken up only by 2 thin screen walls that were never meant to hold back water. They kept the cargo from shifting. They were not watertight bulkheads. On an ocean ship, the hull is divided into sealed compartments so that water flooding into one is trapped there and the rest of the ship stays afloat. The Fitzgerald had almost none of that. Let water into her hold, and there was little inside her to stop it running the whole length of the ship. One writer put it with brutal simplicity. "The Great Lakes ore carrier," he said, "is nothing but a motorized barge, and in theory a hole the width of a fist in the cargo hold could sink it." And consider, last, how she was made. She was among the first ships built at that yard from great sections welded together rather than riveted, joined by seams of molten metal rather than by iron pins. And she was stretched to very nearly the longest a ship could be, and still fit the locks of the seaway. A naval architect who had worked at the yard would say years later that the size limits forced her hull into a straitjacket, that a ship so long for her depth would bend and work in a heavy sea, and that welded seams, unlike riveted ones, can crack and run. Nobody worried about it in 1958. She was the queen of the lakes, and she had 1,000,000 miles of good behavior still ahead of her. The launch itself, looking back, reads like a page of omens. It took the sponsor 3 swings to break the champagne bottle across her bow. There was a delay of 36 minutes before the men could knock away the blocks that held her. When she finally went in, sideways, she threw up a wave that soaked the crowd and slammed her hull against a pier before she settled, and men who saw it swore she looked as if she were trying to climb back out of the water. And a man who had come to watch her christening, standing among the thousands on the bank, clutched his chest and died where he stood. None of it meant anything, of course. It was only a big ship and a big crowd and the ordinary accidents of a public day. Only later, when she was gone, would people remember how strangely her life had begun. By the last afternoon of her life, she was running for the safety of Whitefish Bay, and she very nearly made it. To understand how close she came, and how completely she failed, you have to follow her out of harbour one last time. She left the ore docks at Superior, Wisconsin, at 2:15 on the afternoon of the 9th of November, loaded with 26,116 long tons of taconite, the hard little pellets of processed iron ore that fed the steel mills of the lower lakes. Her destination was a mill on Zug Island, near Detroit. A run of some 5 days there and back, that she had made scores of times. Her master was Captain Ernest McSorley, 63 years old, the oldest man aboard, a lifelong lakes sailor with a reputation as a captain who could take a ship through weather that made other men run for cover. She did not sail alone. Soon after leaving, she fell in with a second freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, under Captain Bernie Cooper, and the two ships kept company through the night, talking on the radio, watching each other on radar, taking the same open water course down the lake. As the storm the forecasters had misjudged climbed north over Superior, the two captains agreed to swing up toward the Canadian shore in search of a little shelter, and they pressed on through winds that were building hour by hour. By the small hours of the 10th, the Fitzgerald was reporting winds near 60 miles an hour and seas 10 feet high. By the afternoon, the wind was screaming past 50 knots with far higher gusts, and the seas had grown to 25 feet and more. The Fitzgerald was the faster ship, and through the day she drew ahead of the Anderson, until by mid-afternoon she was some 16 miles in front, a shape on Cooper's radar screen rather than a light on the water. Then the snow came, thick and blinding, and even the shape was gone. From that point, the two ships knew each other only by voice, and the voice from the Fitzgerald, calm as it stayed, began to carry bad news. She had lost vent covers. She had taken on a list, a lean to one side that would not come back. She was taking heavy water over her deck. Her radars had failed, leaving her blind in the blizzard, and she was asking the Anderson to guide her toward the shelter of Whitefish Bay. And then, at 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, the last exchange. The Anderson called to ask how she was making out. Back across the static came Captain McSorley, unhurried, almost reassuring. He was holding his own. It was the last that was ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Within 10 minutes, the shape that had marked her on the Anderson's radar was gone from the screen. Cooper waited and searched the clutter of snow and sea on his radar, and told himself she had simply slipped into the shadow of the land ahead. But she had not slipped into any shadow. In the space of a few minutes, without a single word of warning, the largest ship on the Great Lakes had gone to the bottom, and every man aboard her had gone with her. She was 17 miles from the entrance to Whitefish Bay when she died. 17 miles, a distance she could have covered in a little over an hour at her full speed, was all that stood between her and the sheltered water she was running for. She did not reach it. When the alarm was finally raised and the search began, aircraft and ships combed the freezing lake through the night and into the following days. They found debris, lifeboats torn loose and battered, life rafts, wreckage on the water. They found no one. Not one of the 29 men aboard was ever recovered. The speed of it was what the searchers could not get past. A ship does not simply cease to exist. Even a fast sinking tends to leave something behind. Survivors clinging to wreckage, a lifeboat pulled clear, a man in the water to be plucked out cold but breathing. The Fitzgerald left almost none of that. Her lifeboats were found smashed and empty, torn from the ship rather than lowered from her, wearing the marks of a vessel that went under before a single boat could be launched in any order. Whatever had happened to her had happened so fast and so completely that her crew never got the chance the sea usually grants, however small and however cruel, to fight for their own lives. It was an aircraft of the United States Navy, 4 days after she sank, that finally located her, its instruments picking up the mass of steel lying on the bottom in Canadian waters. Later, surveys with sonar began to sketch the shape of what lay down there, and the shape made no easy sense. She was not resting in one piece, as a ship that had simply filled and settled might. She was in 2 great sections, broken apart, lying in 530 feet of cold water. The sea had not just taken her, It had torn her in half. That was the mystery the wreck set before the world, and it is the mystery this film is about. Not whether she sank, for that was plain, and not where, for the Navy had found her. The question was how. How does the largest, ablest, most admired ship on the lakes, commanded by a captain who had beaten 100 November storms, go down so fast and so completely that she cannot even cry out? What reached up out of that black water and pulled her under before a single man could send a call for help? To answer that, you have to stop looking at the storm and start reading the evidence she left behind. The first sign that something was wrong came not as an alarm, but as a captain's flat voice reporting damage he could not explain. It was shortly after 3:30 on the afternoon of the 10th of November, when McSorley called across to the Anderson with the first bad news of the day. The Fitzgerald had lost 2 of the covers over her vents, and a length of fence railing on her deck had been carried away, and she had begun to take on water, and she had developed a list. He was already running 2 of his bilge pumps to fight it, and he would slow down, he said, so the Anderson could close the distance between them. There was no fear in it. It was a working captain reporting a working problem. But every word of it, read now with the knowledge of how the evening ended, is the sound of a ship beginning to die. To understand why that short message matters so much, you have to understand what McSorley could and could not know about his own ship. Above the deck, he could see plainly enough what the storm was doing to her. He could see the seas breaking over her length. He could see, or be told, that vents were gone and railing was down, but he could not see into his own cargo hold. The Fitzgerald had no gauge, no system, no instrument of any kind to tell her master how much water might be gathering below, down among the 26,000 tons of iron pellets. If the lake was finding its way into that hold, whether through a failing hatch or a wounded hull or a torn vent, McSorley would learn of it only from the way she rode, from the lean of the deck under his feet. He was fighting a fire he could not see, in a room he could not enter, and she was riding lower than her builders had ever meant her to. Over the years, the rules had been changed 3 times to let ships like her load more heavily, to sit deeper in the water and carry more iron on each trip. Each change shaved a little more off the margin of safety, the height of solid hull between the deck and the waterline. By the autumn of 1975, the Fitzgerald was allowed to load so that her deck stood only about 11 feet above the surface in calm water. Now put that ship in seas of 25 and 35 feet. The waves were not merely splashing against her. They were rolling clean over her deck, green water the height of a house sweeping the length of her again and again, hammering at every hatch and vent and seam. A ship built to keep the lake out was spending the whole afternoon with the lake pouring over the top of her. Consider what that steady hammering meant for a ship already low and already leaning. Each sea that boarded her carried tons of water the length of her deck, searching for any way below. Every vent, every hatch seam, every opening the storm had already worked loose. She had lost the covers off 2 of her vents. McSorley had said so himself, and a vent with its cover gone is an open pipe leading down into the tanks and tunnels beneath the deck. Water finding its way down through a lost vent would never show in the cargo hold at all. It would gather low in the hull, off to one side, and it would pull her down into exactly the kind of list her captain could feel under his feet, but could not explain or reach. The wound was below, out of sight, and it was widening with every wave. The list McSorley reported was the tell. A ship does not lean and stay leaning for no reason. Something was pulling her down on one side and holding her there, and the most likely something was water, weight that should not have been aboard, gathering in a tank or a tunnel or the hold itself. He answered it the only ways he had. He ran his pumps. He slowed his ship. He asked the Anderson to stay close. None of it addressed the cause, because he did not know the cause, and he had no way to find it out. All he could do was manage the symptoms of a sickness he could not diagnose, and hope the sickness was slower than the 17 miles still between him and shelter. The Anderson, trailing behind, could only listen and watch and try to help. Cooper kept the Fitzgerald on his radar as long as he could, and passed her what guidance he could give. Around them, both the storm was still building. The wind was gusting far beyond 50 knots. The seas were growing. And somewhere in that same water, though neither captain knew it yet, waves of a size that could break a ship were forming and rolling east, toward the very stretch of lake the Fitzgerald had to cross. Then came the next message, and it took away what little the ship had left. Shortly after 10 minutes past 4, McSorley called again. Both of his radars had failed. In a blinding snowstorm, on a lake with rocks and shoals and a shoreline she could not see, the Fitzgerald had gone blind. She could no longer find her own way. She slowed further and asked the Anderson to track her and steer her, to be her eyes across 10 miles of screaming water. A wounded ship, leaning and taking water, was now also a blind one, feeling her way toward a harbour she could not see, guided only by a friend's voice on the radio, and the worst of the night was still ahead of her. Blind now in a blizzard, the ship asked another vessel to be her eyes across 10 miles of screaming water. It is one of the hardest things to sit with in the whole story, this picture of a great ship gone dark and deaf, leaning into the storm, trusting her life to the radar of a smaller freighter miles behind her. And it grew worse. McSorley needed a light to steer for, and the light he wanted was at Whitefish Point, the beacon that marked the mouth of the sheltered bay he was running toward. So at 39 minutes past 4, he called the Coast Guard station on shore and asked whether the Whitefish Point light and its radio beacon were working. The answer came back that both were out. The one fixed mark he was steering for, the light at the end of his run, had failed too. Ship blind, night black, beacon dark. Everything that could have guided her home had been taken away, one piece at a time. A little later, another vessel entered the story, an ocean-going ship called the Avafors that was upbound on the lake. Her pilot, a man named Cedric Woodard, got the Fitzgerald on the radio between 5 and 5:30 in the evening, and what he heard has haunted the case ever since. At one point, he overheard McSorley say something to his own crew, a short, hard order carried faintly over the open channel. Do not allow anybody on deck. On a ship taking heavy seas over her length, that order means one thing. The deck was a place where a man would be swept away and lost. Whatever was happening to the Fitzgerald, it had already reached the point where to step outside was to die. Then McSorley spoke to Woodard directly and gave the plainest account of his ship's condition anyone would ever hear. He had a bad list. He had lost both of his radars, and he was taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas he had ever been in. Sit with that last phrase for a moment, because of who said it. This was not a nervous young officer on his first bad night. This was a 63-year-old master with a lifetime of November crossings behind him, a captain famous for driving his ship through weather that turned other men back. For McSorley to say that this was one of the worst seas he had ever seen is like a veteran soldier saying he had never been in a fight like this one. The man who feared nothing on the lake was telling another sailor how bad it had become. And notice what he did not say, because the silence is its own kind of evidence. He did not say he was in trouble he could not handle. He did not ask anyone to stand by to take off his crew. A captain who believed his ship was about to founder would be making very different calls into the night, readying his boats, counting the miles to the nearest help. warning the men below. McSorley did none of that, and the reason is almost certainly the simplest one. He did not know. His ship was dying beneath him in a way he could not see and could not measure, and by the time the full truth of it reached the deck, he stood on. There would be no time left to do anything about it at all. And still, through all of it, there was no panic in his voice, no mayday, no call for help. He reported his damage the way a man reports the weather, and he kept his ship pointed at Whitefish Bay, and he kept fighting. Behind him, the Anderson pressed on through the same storm, and around 6:30, Cooper's own ship was struck by two enormous seas, one after the other, walls of water perhaps 35 feet high that buried her aft cabins and came green over her bridge. Cooper watched them pass under his ship and roll on ahead into the dark toward the Fitzgerald, and he would remember them for the rest of his life. Then came 7:10, and the last human words the Fitzgerald ever sent. The Anderson called across to warn of another ship in the area and to ask once more how the Fitzgerald was doing, and McSorley answered, "We are holding our own." 4 words, calm and almost gentle, a captain telling a friend not to worry. They are among the most famous last words in the history of the lakes, and they are terrible precisely because of how ordinary they sound. He believed them. He believed his ship was fighting through it, that the pumps and the slow speed and the 17 miles were adding up to survival. He did not know that his ship had perhaps a few minutes left to live, because within 10 minutes of those 4 words, she was gone. The mark on the Anderson's radar that had been the Fitzgerald simply was not there anymore. There was no explosion of noise on the radio, no scream, no burst of distress, nothing. A ship of 729 feet and 29 men went from holding her own to gone from the face of the lake in less time than it takes to boil a kettle. And that suddenness is not just the horror of the story. It is the single most important piece of evidence in it. Whatever killed the Edmund Fitzgerald did not give her master even the few seconds it would have taken to key a microphone and shout for help. It happened faster than a man could reach for a radio. When the Navy's robot camera finally reached her, it found not a ship, but the pieces of one, arranged like a sentence no one could read. In the spring following the sinking, a remotely operated vehicle was sent down into the 530 feet of water where she lay, trailing its cable from a ship on the surface, its lights probing the cold dark of the bottom. And what its cameras found settled one question forever while opening a dozen others. The Edmund Fitzgerald was not resting on the lakebed as one ship. She was lying there in 2 great pieces. The bow, the forward section, ran to something like 276 feet, and it sat upright in the mud, driven down into the bottom, roughly the shape it had always been. The stern, the after section, was around 253 feet long, and it lay capsized, rolled completely over and canted at an angle, its underside to the world. Between the 2 halves stretched a field of scattered wreckage and a great heap of the taconite pellets she had been carrying, spilled across the bottom. The 2 sections did not lie neatly nose to tail, as if a ship had simply cracked and settled in place. They lay apart, separated by better than 170 feet of debris, in later surveys measured at some 255 feet from one to the other. To picture it, imagine taking the largest ship on the lakes, a hull longer than 2.5 football fields, and snapping her across the middle like a stick, then setting the 2 halves down on a black plain, a football field and a half apart, one upright, one turned upside down, and pouring her whole cargo out in a long heap between them. That is what lay on the bottom of Lake Superior. It is not the resting place of a ship that filled quietly and settled. It is the scene of something violent, something that pulled a giant apart. and the robot's lights could only crawl over it a piece at a time, 530 feet down, where the water is always black and only a few degrees above ice. That arrangement is not just a sad picture. It is an argument, and everyone who has ever studied the wreck has had to reckon with it. Think about what it means. If the Fitzgerald had gone down whole, sliding under the surface in one piece and only breaking apart when she struck the bottom, then the two halves and her cargo should lie close together, roughly where the hull hit the mud, a single wound on the lake bed. But that is not what the robot found. It found the halves flung well apart, with the oar spread in a long trail between them. To many who looked at it, that spread of wreckage could only mean one thing. She had not gone down in one piece at all. She had come apart up above, at or near the surface, the two halves parting and sinking separately, the stern rolling over and pouring out her cargo as she went, so that ship and iron rained down across a wide patch of bottom rather than dropping in a single heap. There was another detail in the wreckage that pointed the same way, and it is a chilling one. The forward section, the bow, did not end in a clean break. It ended abruptly just behind the 8th hatch, as if the ship had been torn across at that point, the long run of her cargo deck simply stopping where the steel had failed. Somewhere around that line, the Fitzgerald had been ripped in two. The question the wreck could not answer was whether that tearing happened on the surface, as the ship fought the seas, or in the plunge to the bottom, or in the impact with the lake bed itself. The pieces were there for anyone to see. What they meant was, and remains, a matter of fierce argument. The surveys came back to her over the years, each with better cameras and better light. They mapped her, filmed her, measured the distances between her broken parts, studied the mud around her for signs of what had happened. And the more carefully she was studied, the more the wreck came to look like the central witness in a trial where the witness cannot speak. Everything anyone would ever know for certain about the mechanism of her death was lying right there on the bottom, in the position of the bow and the stern, the spread of the taconite, the line of the tear behind the 8th hatch. It was all evidence. It simply refused to resolve into a single, undeniable story. And there was one piece of that evidence that mattered above all the others, one part of the ship that every theory would rise or fall upon, and the cameras went looking for it in the wreckage, the hatches, the great steel covers over her cargo hold, and the clamps that were meant to hold them down. What state they were found in, buckled or missing or fastened or sprung, would become the most closely argued detail in the entire case, because the hatches sat exactly at the border between the storm outside and the one space inside the ship that could never be allowed to flood. To read the hatches was to read the door through which the lake had come in. And what the cameras found there was stranger and more troubling than anyone had expected. 20 years after she sank, a submersible drifted along her buried bow, and its lights found a man. He lay near the front of the wreck, dressed in coveralls, wearing a life jacket, one of the 29 who had never come home, held now in the cold and the dark 530 feet down. The discovery was not sought, and it was not welcome. It caused real anguish among the families, and it became one of the reasons the wreck would eventually be protected by law and left in peace. But as evidence, it says something no document can. At least one man aboard the Fitzgerald, in her final minutes, knew enough of what was coming to reach for a life jacket and put it on. Somewhere in that sudden ending, there was a moment, however short, when a sailor understood that the ship was lost. What there was not was time. Time to launch a boat, time to send a call, time to save a single life. That lone figure by the bow is the human heart of the evidence, but it sits among a great deal of cold physical fact, and the coldest of it concerned the hatches. When investigators studied the images of the wreck, they built up a picture of the covers over the cargo hold. and the picture was a broken one. Some of the great steel covers were gone entirely, torn away and lying somewhere in the debris. At least one had buckled inward, pressed down into the hold as if a giant hand had shoved it. On one of the hatch openings, the clamps that should have held the cover tight were found in a strange state. A run of them along the coaming, a few near the ends broken or bent, and the long stretch in the middle simply hanging open, undamaged and unfastened. That last detail became one of the most argued points in the whole case, because it could be read two opposite ways. One reading said the open clamps were proof of neglect, that the covers had never been properly fastened in the first place, that the crew had gone to sea with the hold effectively open to any wave that chose to break over it. The other reading said the clamps had been wrenched open by the sheer violence of the water and the twisting of the failing hull, that they were undamaged and open, not because a man had left them so, but because the ship was coming apart around them. The same steel, the same clamps, told two different stories depending on who was telling it, and no camera could settle which was true. The detail of it was almost unbearably precise. Investigators counted the covers and the coamings one by one and wrote down the state of each. One of the forward hatch covers had been driven downward, buckled into the hold. Others were simply gone, ripped away, their openings left bare to the water. Along one coaming a row of clamps was mapped, a few near the ends wrenched and broken, the long run of them in between hanging open and unmarked. Every one of those small facts was a word in a sentence no one could quite finish, because each could be the cause of the flooding or the result of the breaking, the reason she went down, or only the mark of her going. The hold had filled. The hatches were how, or the hatches were where. The steel would say no more than that. Around the broken bow lay the rest of it. The spilled taconite, 26,000 tons of iron pellets scattered across the bottom, some of it heaped between the two halves, some of it, the surveys suggested, lying beneath the overturned stern as though the stern had rolled and settled down on top of its own cargo. Hull plating torn loose, the clean tear behind the 8th hatch, the stern capsized, the bow upright, the long distance between them. Piece by piece, the wreck laid out everything it had to offer, and piece by piece it declined to add up to a verdict. This is the strange and maddening centre of the Edmund Fitzgerald. In most disasters, the hard part is finding out what happened. Here, almost everything that happened is known. The ship was found. Her broken body was mapped in detail. The timeline of her last afternoon was written down, hour by hour, in the radio log of the ship that watched her die. The state of her hatches, the position of her halves, the spread of her cargo, the man in the life jacket by the bow, all of it is on the record. And still, with all of it laid out, the central question refuses to close. The evidence is nearly complete. The answer is not. So this is the ground rule for everything that follows, the test that every theory of her death must pass. Whatever story anyone tells about the last minutes of the Fitzgerald has to fit these facts. It has to explain a ship that was taking water and leaning by 3:30. It has to explain a loss so sudden that a calm captain never sent a distress call. It has to explain two halves flung apart on the bottom, a tear behind the 8th hatch, a field of spilled ore, hatches missing and buckled and sprung. Any theory that cannot account for all of that is not the answer, however loudly it is argued. And over the 50 years since she sank, 4 great theories have risen to try to meet that test. They do not agree. And the weakest of them was also, for a long time, the loudest. The men who ran the lake boats had a simpler answer, and a reason of their own to prefer it. Their theory was that the Fitzgerald never really died in the open lake at all. but was mortally wounded hours earlier near a small piece of land called Caribou Island, on a shoal that the charts did not properly show. Early in the storm, before the worst of it came, the Fitzgerald had passed close by that island. The captain of the Anderson, watching on radar, thought she had passed dangerously near the shallow water there, a place called 6 Fathom Shoal, where the lakebed rises up close to the surface without warning. The theory holds that as she crossed it, the Fitzgerald raked her bottom over the rocks, opened a wound in her hull below the waterline, and began, from that moment, to fill. There is a genuine case for it, and it deserves to be taken seriously. After the sinking, a survey of that stretch of water found that the dangerous shallow ground ran about a mile farther east than the charts of the day showed. In other words, a captain steering by the chart could have believed he was in safe deep water while actually passing over rock close beneath his keel. The officers of the Anderson had watched the Fitzgerald sail through exactly that area, and a grounding might explain some of what came later: the list, the flooding, even the downed fence railing, if the ship had bent and worked over the shoal in a way that damaged her deck. Put together, it paints a picture of a ship already dying long before her last message, carrying a hidden wound south into the storm. There was a bolder version of the idea that went further still, placing the grounding not near Caribou Island, but on another shallow patch farther north, and holding that the ship had raked a long stretch of her bottom hours before she sank. In that telling, the storm itself seemed to lend a hand to the argument, for the same weather was said to have shoved the water of the lake up over the locks downstream in a surge strong enough to flood a street in the town there. A ship that had dragged her belly over rock, the reasoning ran, would carry the injury quietly for hours before the flooding finally overwhelmed her. It is a vivid picture, and like the first version of the shoaling story, it leans its whole weight on a hidden hurt that the crew could neither see nor stop. But the theory has to answer the wreck, and the wreck does not cooperate. When the surveys studied the hull, the propeller, the rudder, the underside of the overturned stern, they found no sign of a grounding, no great scrape, no crushed plating, no rock scar of the kind a ship would carry if she had dragged her bottom across a reef. The one place such damage should show, the ship's bottom, was examined, and it was not there. A ship that had torn herself open on 6 Fathom Shoal should wear the mark of it. The Fitzgerald did not. And then there is the uncomfortable question of who was arguing for the shoal, and why. The loudest champions of the grounding theory were the very people with the most to lose from any other explanation, the association that represented the shipping companies. If the Fitzgerald had struck an uncharted rock, then no one was truly to blame. Not the men who loaded her low, not the society that had passed her as fit, not the rules that let her sail with a hold that could not be sealed. It was simply an accident of nature, a rock in the wrong place. Nobody's fault. Critics pointed out sharply that the shoaling story was wonderfully convenient for the industry, because it moved the cause of death away from the design of the ship and the way she was loaded and out onto a reef that no company had built. When a theory happens to clear everyone who might otherwise be responsible, it is worth asking whether the evidence is driving the theory or the other way around. None of this makes the men who favoured the shoal into liars. Reasonable people looked at the same lake, the same island, the same uncharted rock, and came to it honestly. But a theory has to be judged on the evidence and not on how comfortable it happens to be. And the evidence, in the end, is the ship herself. She was raised into the light of the cameras and studied from bow to stern, and the wound a reef would have left was not on her. A ship that has torn her bottom open on rock carries the proof of it in her plating for anyone to find. The Fitzgerald carried no such proof, and no argument, however convenient, could paint a scar onto steel that did not have one. So the reef is set aside, not because it is impossible, but because the ship's own body denies it. She carried no scar, and the case for it leaned, more than a little, on the wishes of men who needed her death to be no one's doing. That is the first theory tested against the evidence, and the first to fall short. The next one would carry the weight of the government itself. The government's own verdict was that the lake simply walked in through the top of the ship, unhurried, all day long. When the Coast Guard finished its long investigation, it settled on the hatches. Its conclusion was that the covers over the cargo hold had not been made properly watertight, that as the seas broke over the deck through the afternoon, the water found its way past those covers and down into the hold, and that it did so gradually, quietly, imperceptibly, all through the final day. Ton by ton, the theory went. The lake filled her hold beneath the crew's feet, and no gauge told them it was happening, until at last the water aboard was enough to rob her of the buoyancy and stability that kept her upright, and she went down without warning. It fits a good deal of the evidence. She was, by her captain's own word, taking water and listing by 3:30. Her deck was under green seas for hours, and when the wreck was examined, most of the clamps that should have secured the covers were found not fastened, which the investigators read as a sign that the covers had never been made tight, that the hold had effectively been open to the storm. A ship loading water slowly into an unsealable hold would eventually reach a point of collapse. And when a ship loses stability, she can go over and down with terrible speed. On paper, the hatch theory explains the flooding, the list, and even the suddenness of the end. There was more to lay at the door of the hatches than the covers alone. The rules had let the Fitzgerald load lower in the water 3 separate times across her career, each change trimming away a little of the solid hull that stood between her deck and the lake. By her last autumn, she rode so deep that her deck was only about 11 feet above the calm surface, and in a storm that meant the seas were not merely brushing her hatches, but burying them, sea after sea, hour after hour. A cover that might have shrugged off spray with a high deck beneath it was instead taking the full weight of green water rolling clean across the ship. The lower she was loaded, the harder the lake worked at every seam, and the rules had made her lower on purpose, so that she could carry a few thousand tons more iron on every single trip. A second federal investigation, by the National Board that studies transport disasters, agreed that flooding of the cargo hold was the killer, but it read the hatches a little differently. Rather than a slow, all-day seep, it favoured a sudden collapse, one or more of the great covers giving way under the weight of the boarding seas late in the evening, the hold opening to the lake in a rush rather than a trickle. That version fits the suddenness even better. A ship holding her own 1 minute could, if a hatch stove in under a mountain of water, be filling catastrophically the next. Either way, government finding met government finding on the same essential point. The lake got into the hold through the top of the ship. And yet, even the men who wrote those findings would not close the door all the way. For all the careful language and the long official reports and the many recommendations that followed, the plain admission underneath it was that no one could prove exactly what had happened. There was no conclusive evidence the record allowed to fix the cause beyond argument. The government had named the hatches as the most probable path for the water, and it may well be right, but it named them as the best reading of the evidence, not as a thing witnessed and proven. That honesty is easy to miss beneath the weight of an official verdict. And it matters, because it left the case open by the government's own hand, but the hatch theory has always had a hard thing to answer, and it came from the very men who worked those ships. The one-piece covers on the lake freighters had been in use for close to 40 years on hundreds of vessels through countless November storms, and in all that time not one ship had been lost because water beat its way in through them. The industry's defenders asked, fairly, how a design with such a long record of keeping the lake out could suddenly, on this one ship, on this one night, let the lake in fast enough to sink her. And the picture of a slow, imperceptible flooding sits awkwardly against the way she actually died. A hold filling gradually all day should give some warning at the end, some slow settling, some final chance to react. What happened to the Fitzgerald was not slow. It was there and then gone, faster than a hand could reach a radio. So the hatches survive as a real possibility, stronger than the reef, backed by 2 federal investigations, fitting the flooding and the list and much of the wreck. But they do not fully answer the suddenness, and they do not sit easily with 40 years of covers that had always held. Something more violent than a slow seep seems to have finished her, something that arrived in the last minutes with the force to end her before she could speak. And there was something in the water that night with exactly that kind of force, something the captain of the Anderson had watched roll past his own ship in the dark. Behind her, the Anderson was hit by 2 mountains of water in a row, and her captain watched them roll on toward his friend. This is the third theory, and it has a power the others lack, because it comes with an eyewitness. Around 6:30 in the evening, less than an hour before the Fitzgerald vanished, Captain Cooper's Anderson was struck by 2 great seas in quick succession, waves perhaps 35 feet high, one burying her stern cabins, the next coming green over her bridge deck, higher than a house. Cooper felt his own ship stagger under them, and then he watched them pass beneath him and run on ahead into the darkness, marching east in the exact direction of the Fitzgerald, and timed so that they would reach her at about the moment she disappeared. There is something almost unbearable in Cooper's position that night. He was miles back, in the same storm, fighting for his own ship, and he had just felt 2 seas nearly overwhelm him. He watched them go, knowing his friend was out there ahead in the dark, lower and slower, and already hurt, and he had no way to warn him and no way to reach him. Whether those exact waves were the ones that finished the Fitzgerald can never be proven. But a man who was there, who felt them lift and bury his own decks, believed to the end of his days that he had watched the instrument of her death roll past his own bow and on into the night toward her. The lakemen have an old name for a run of such waves, the 3 Sisters. It describes a set of rogue seas that come not singly, but in a rapid group of 3, each larger than the ordinary run of the storm, striking a ship so fast one after another that the deck cannot clear the water from the first before the second and third crash aboard. A ship caught by the 3 Sisters can be buried under water faster than she can shed it, pressed down at the bow or the stern, held under just long enough to lose her fight for the surface. If such a set of waves found the Fitzgerald in her last minutes, already leaning, already low, already heavy with whatever water she had taken, it could have been the blow that finished her, driving her nose down and under before McSorley could draw breath to call for help. The science that came later gave the idea real weight. A detailed recreation of the storm, built decades on from the wind and wave records of that night, found that the Fitzgerald had sunk at the worst possible place at the worst possible moment, in a corner of the lake where the wind had the longest reach to pile the seas high. It calculated that near where she died, the winds were gusting to something near hurricane force, and that in seas of that size, roughly 1 wave in 100 would have stood 36 feet tall, and about 1 in 1,000 would have reached 46 feet. Waves like that were not freak impossibilities that night. They were rare, but they were out there. and the Fitzgerald was in exactly the water where they ran tallest. A later test in a wave tank, using a model and an engineered rogue sea, showed that a single wave of such a size could very nearly bury the bow of a ship, pressing it under, at least for a moment. The recreation of that night filled in the picture wave by wave. Across the eastern end of the lake, where the Fitzgerald was making her run, the average height of the seas had climbed past 19 feet by early evening and kept on climbing, toward 23 and then 25 feet as the hours passed, with the true giants standing half again as tall as that. The wind had a long, clear reach of open water to work across, and the longer the reach, the higher the seas it can build, and the Fitzgerald was in the worst of it at the worst possible hour. She was not merely caught in a storm. She was in the one corner of the lake where that particular storm was raising the largest waves it would make all night, and she was there at the exact moment they came to their peak. So the wave theory answers the suddenness that the slow hatch flooding could not. It gives a mechanism for a ship to go from holding her own to gone in minutes. It comes with a captain who saw the very waves that may have done it. And it fits the picture of a buoy driven down, which matches a forward section found driven upright into the mud. Of the theories, it may be the most satisfying as pure drama, the great sea reaching up out of the dark to take her. And yet it cannot stand entirely alone. And this is the crucial point. A rogue wave is a trigger, not a cause. A sound ship, riding high, with a sealed and subdivided hull, can take a great wave over her deck, shudder, shed the water, and live. Ships do it in every ocean storm. The question the wave theory cannot answer by itself is why this ship, on this night, could not survive a blow that other ships survive. Why the water that came aboard did not simply run off, but stayed and dragged her down. To answer that, you have to stop looking at the wave and look instead at the ship it struck, and at the flaw that had been built into her 17 years before, waiting for exactly such a night. The strongest case against her was written into her own steel the day she was designed. This is the fourth theory, and it is the one this film believes comes closest to the truth. And it starts with those two broken halves lying far apart on the bottom. Remember what the wreck showed. The bow and the stern were not close together, as they would be if she had sunk whole and cracked on impact. They were flung better than 250 feet apart, with her cargo spread in a long trail between them, and the stern rolled completely over, lying, the surveys suggested, on top of its own spilled ore. To the investigators who studied that pattern most closely, it could mean only one thing. The Fitzgerald did not sink in one piece and break on the bottom. She broke up high, at or near the surface, the two halves parting and going down separately, the stern rolling and pouring out its iron as it fell. If that is true, then she did not merely flood. She broke. Her long hull failed and tore in two while she was still fighting on the surface, and the men who knew her best were not surprised to hear it. One of her own former officers said flatly that she had a habit of bending and springing in a heavy sea, working up and down like a diving board after someone has jumped off it, and he laid her loss to hull failure, pure and simple, saying he had seen the paint in her tunnels crack under the strain of the flexing. A man who had served long aboard her said the keel itself had been only lightly welded, with broken welds along her spine, that she was not the solid thing she looked. A shipyard architect said the size limits of the seaway had forced her into a hull too long and slender for her own good, one that would work and bend in the seas until something let go. Another expert, studying photographs of her welds, said the hull looked as if it were being held together with patching plates. What gives that testimony its weight is who was giving it and how little it was wanted. These were not outside critics with a grievance to air. They were men who had walked her tunnels and slept in her hull and felt her work beneath them in heavy weather. The steward who spoke of the lightly welded keel was never even called to give evidence before the board. The officer who described her springing like a diving board had left her before the end and lived to say what he had seen. Their accounts did not fit the tidier conclusions that others preferred, and so they sat at the edge of the record, the words of the people who had known her best, warning of the exact failure that the wreck on the bottom seemed to show. And here is where the wreck, the wave, and the flaw all come together into a single terrible picture. The Fitzgerald was a hull stretched to the very limit of her length, joined by welds rather than rivets, flexing and springing in heavy weather across a career of 1,000,000 hard miles. She was loaded low, deeper than her designers had first allowed, so that her deck rode only feet above the water. Her one vast hold could not be sealed off, split only by screens that would not hold back a flood. She had no way to measure the water gathering inside her, and on her last night she was taking that water, leaning with it, blind and beaten, when the storm sent its largest seas rolling down upon her. Whatever struck the final blow, a stove in hatch, a mountain of water, a weld that finally let go, it fell upon a ship that had no reserve left to survive it. The water that came in could not be contained. The hull that was already working could not take the strain. And a ship with no margin left simply came apart and went down. This is the fatal flaw the title promises, and it is not one clamp or one wave. It is the whole bargain the ship was built on. Make her as long as the locks allow, weld her instead of riveting her, leave the hold open end to carry more iron, load her lower each year to carry still more. Trust that a good captain can always run for Whitefish Bay before the worst arrives. Not one of those choices sank her by itself. Every one of them was defensible on the day it was made. But together, they built a ship that could survive any ordinary night and could not survive the one night the lake called every bet at once. Argue the door all you like, the hatch, the reef, the wave. The house was built to burn. That is why the file has never truly closed, and why it perhaps never can. The mystery of which opening let the water in first is real, but it may be almost beside the point, because every path through the evidence leads to the same locked room, a flooded hold on a ship designed to trust that it would never flood. And the reason to believe it is not merely argument. Twice before, on these same lakes, in these same welded ore carriers, the sequence had already played out to the letter. The Fitzgerald was not the first of her kind to break in half in a storm and take her whole crew into the dark. She was only the largest and the last, and the one the world could not forget. Twice before, on these same lakes, a great ore carrier had simply broken in two and taken her crew down in the dark. The Fitzgerald cannot testify to her own last minutes, but she does not have to, because sisters of her kind had already shown, in earlier storms, exactly how a long welded lake freighter comes to her end. Years before the Fitzgerald sailed her last, another great carrier had broken apart in a November gale on the lakes, her hull failing and parting in heavy seas, most of her men lost to the cold water. And some years after that, a second carrier met almost the identical fate on another of the inland seas, snapping in two in a storm, her forward and after sections separating, her crew swept into the freezing dark. Both were welded ships. Both broke where the strain was greatest. Both went from working vessels to wreckage with the same brutal speed. That doubling is what lets the Fitzgerald's silence be broken. She left no survivor to describe her end, but her sisters had, in their way, already described it for her. The way an overlong hull rides a following sea, lifted high at one point and hanging unsupported at another, worked up and down until the steel along her spine can take no more. The way the break comes not with warning, but all at once. The way the two halves part and the men sealed below go down with almost no chance at all. To read those earlier wrecks is to be handed the ending the Fitzgerald herself could not speak, and to carry it back with you to her last minutes on the 10th of November. These were not distant, unrelated tragedies. To anyone studying the Fitzgerald, they were the same story told earlier, in slightly smaller letters. They proved that the thing the doubters said could not happen, a big lake freighter simply breaking her back in a storm, not only could happen, but had happened, more than once, on these very waters, to ships built on the same principles. The welded hull, the long, slender body, the heavy load, the following seas working the steel up and down until something let go. It was a known failure. It had a track record. The Fitzgerald did not invent a new way to die. She died the way her kind had died before. There was an even closer shadow than those two lost ships. The Fitzgerald had a near sister, a carrier much like her in build, and in the years after, the sinking questions began to gather around that ship too, around whether the same long welded hulls carried the same hidden weakness. When investigators wanted to study a vessel of the type underway in a seaway, to watch with their own eyes how such a hull behaved when the water worked it, the owners refused to let the head of the safety board sail aboard the sister to see for himself. Before long, that ship was quietly taken out of service, and in time she was cut up for scrap. Whatever the truth of her, the reluctance to let anyone examine her under load sat uneasily beside a disaster that so many believed had begun with a hull working itself to pieces. And there was a bitter echo in the way the industry responded, then and later. After each of those earlier losses, there had been calls to make the ships safer, to build in the watertight subdivision that ocean vessels had, to seal the great hold into compartments so that flooding in one place could not run the length of the ship and take her down. Each time, the argument had been made that such changes were too costly, that the lake trade could not bear them, that the ships were safe enough as they were. And so the great Flaw was left in place, carrier after carrier, decade after decade. The Fitzgerald was built with it. She sailed her whole life with it. And on the 10th of November, she paid for it, the way two ships before her had paid, in full, with every soul aboard. It is worth being clear about why the Flaw was left in place, because it was not ignorance. Everyone in the trade understood that a hold which could not be sealed was a danger. The reason it survived was money. Watertight compartments cost cargo space and cost cash, and a ship divided into sealed holds carries less iron and earns less on every run. So the calculation was made, quietly, again and again, that the risk was worth the profit, that the storms could be dodged and the harbours were near and the ships had always come home before. The Fitzgerald was the bill for that calculation, presented on one November night, and paid by 29 men who had never once sat in the rooms where it was decided. So when the reconstruction of her final minutes is built, it is not built on guesswork. It is built on the timeline written in the Andersons' radio log, on the position of the two halves and the spread of the oar across the bottom, on the state of her hatches, on the man in the life jacket by the bow, and on the plain fact that ships exactly like her had broken exactly this way before. Put all of it together, and the last minutes of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which no living eye ever saw, can be told with a terrible confidence. It is the one thing the evidence will finally give, freely and completely. The end. No living eye saw the end, and so the wreck itself must be made to speak. Begin where the record leaves off, at 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, with the storm at its full height and the Fitzgerald leaning into the dark. She is low in the water, lower than she should be, Some water already inside her from the long afternoon of boarding seas, water she cannot measure and cannot pump out fast enough. Her deck stands only a little more than the height of a man above the surface in calm water, and there is no calm water now. There are seas of 25 and 35 feet, walls of black lake sweeping her length, burying her bow and running aft along her deck before they roll off her stern. She is blind, both radars dead. She is deaf to any beacon, the Whitefish light gone dark. And she is tired. 17 years and 1,000,000 miles of flexing steel, working now in the worst sea her captain has ever known. She is heavy at the head. The water she has taken has gathered forward, pulling her bow down, and each great sea that comes aboard presses it lower still. A ship, riding right, lifts her bow to a wave and rises over it. A ship pressed down and heavy does not rise. She drives her bow into the face of the next sea instead of climbing it, takes the whole weight of it green across her deck, and comes up a little slower, a little lower, each time. Somewhere in that last handful of minutes, there comes a wave she cannot climb out from under at all, perhaps one of the 3 sisters the Anderson had felt pass, and her bow goes down and does not come back up. There would have been perhaps a minute in it, maybe less, from the last ordinary moment to the end. Below decks, in the engine room aft, men are working by the light and the roar of the machinery, feeling the ship pitch, knowing nothing of what the bow is doing far ahead of them in the dark. In the crew quarters, off-watch men brace in their bunks against the roll of her. Forward, someone has understood, has reached in the last few seconds for a life jacket. None of them can reach the deck, because the deck is death, because the captain himself has given the order that no one is to go out onto it. They are sealed inside a hull that is about to fold, and there is nowhere in it that is safe, and there is no time left to find one. One instant holds them all. The wheelsman at his post, feeling the bow refuse to rise. The engineers below in the light and the noise. The off-watch men braced in their bunks. The captain in the pilot house, who has driven this ship through a lifetime of bad water and told a friend only minutes ago that he was holding his own. The sailor forward with his life jacket on. For a single second, they are all still alive, all still aboard a ship that is still, barely, a ship. And then the second passes, and the bow drives down, and the long hull folds, and the lake takes every one of them at once, so quickly that not one of them can send a single word ahead into the dark. Now it happens fast, faster than telling. With her nose driven under and her long hull pressed between the sea holding her bow and the buoyancy still lifting her stern, the strain on her overworked steel passes anything she was built to bear. Somewhere around the 8th hatch, the place where the wreck would later be found torn clean across, the hull begins to fail. The deck opens. The lake, which has been trying to get into her hold all day through vents and hatches and seams, now gets in all at once through the ship herself. In the space of seconds, she is no longer a ship taking water. She is a ship coming apart. The bow, full and heavy, drives downward for the bottom. The stern, its engines and its great screw, is left behind for a moment on the surface, then rolls over as it too begins to go. Picture the men in that instant, because the evidence says at least one of them understood. Somewhere forward, a sailor has pulled on a life jacket, has grasped what is happening in the seconds he has been given. In the pilot house, Captain McSorley, who has fought this ship all day and told a friend minutes ago that he was holding his own, feels the deck drop away beneath him as the bow goes down. There is no time to reach the radio he had spoken into moments before. No time to sound a horn, launch a boat, shout a warning to the men below. The lights go under. The forward section plunges through 530 feet of black, freezing water and buries its bow in the mud of the bottom, still roughly upright. The stern, capsized now, follows it down, spilling 26,000 tons of iron pellets across the lakebed as it falls, and comes to rest, overturned, better than 200 feet from the bow, atop its own scattered cargo. And then the lake is simply the lake again. The wind still screams and the seas still run, but the Edmund Fitzgerald is gone, all of her, in less time than it has taken to describe it. Behind her, the Anderson searches a radar screen full of snow and finds nothing where the mark had been. The suddenness that opened this story is explained at last, and it is the most merciless thing in it. She did not sink slowly enough for anyone to be saved. She did not sink slowly enough for anyone to cry out. One moment she was holding her own, 17 miles from shelter, and the next she was on the bottom of Lake Superior with all 29 of her men, and the water closed over her as if she had never been there at all. She rests now where no diver is allowed to trouble her, a grave the length of 2 football fields, cold and green in the dark. She lies in Canadian waters, 530 feet down, in 2 broken pieces separated by that long field of iron and torn steel, and the law now guards her. After the years of expeditions, after the cameras and the submersibles, and the discovery of the man by the bow, the site was set apart and protected. Diving and surveying forbidden within a wide circle around the wreck without a license, on pain of heavy fines. She is a war grave in all but name, and she is meant to be left in peace. In the summer of 1995, one last expedition was allowed to take something from her, and what it took was her bell. Divers raised the great bronze bell from her pilot house, and in its place they left a replica, engraved with the names of the 29 men who never came home. That bell became the way the world chose to remember her. The day after she sank, a Mariners' Church in Detroit rang its own bell 29 times, once for each man lost, and it went on ringing for them, year after year, a slow toll of names in a cold season. The recovered bell of the Fitzgerald herself now hangs in a museum near the point she had been trying to reach, rung in memory each year for her crew, and in time for all the lake's dead. And there was the song. A Canadian singer read a magazine account of the wreck and set it to music, and his ballad of the Edmund Fitzgerald rose to the 2nd spot on the American charts and never left the memory of anyone who heard it. It is why a working oar boat, of all the thousands that have crossed the lakes, is the one whose name the whole world knows. She was made immortal not by what she carried, but by how she died, and by a voice that would not let her be forgotten. But under the song and the bell and the yearly toll, there is a harder thing to sit with, and it is the real lesson of the Fitzgerald. For years, the easiest story to tell was that her crew had somehow failed, that hatches were left unfastened, that a captain drove her too hard, that men were careless and paid for it. It is worth noticing how comforting that story is, and to whom. If the crew failed, then the ship was sound, the design was safe, the rules were right, and nothing needed to change. But the evidence does not support blaming the dead. It points instead to a ship that was built and loaded and driven exactly as her owners and her rules and her whole industry intended, and that was never given the one thing that might have saved her: a hull that could seal the lake into one compartment instead of letting it run the length of her and pull her down. The men did not fail the ship. The ship and the choices behind her failed the men, and the choices did not change, not really. Even after the Fitzgerald, the calls to seal the great holds into watertight compartments were beaten back, again, on the same grounds as before, that it would cost too much, that the trade could not bear it. Some things did improve: depth finders and survival suits, and better forecasts, and the yearly inspections of hatches before the killing season. But the deepest flaw, the one that made a flooded hold a death sentence, was left where it had always been, because fixing it was expensive and leaving it was cheap, and the ships kept sailing. That is the truth the Fitzgerald holds at the bottom of Lake Superior, the truth beneath the mystery of which door the water came through. She died of ordinary decisions made by people who were never on board, and the men who paid for those decisions are the ones the story too often blamed. One of the meteorologists who later recreated that night looked at everything: the storm, the winds, the place, the hour, and put the whole tragedy into a single sentence. "It ended," he said, "in precisely the wrong place at the absolute worst time." That is as close to a verdict as the Edmund Fitzgerald will ever allow. She crossed the wrong stretch of water in the worst storm of a killing month, in a hull that had been quietly on borrowed time since the day she was welded together, and the lake found the one flaw that mattered and took her whole. On the Andersons' radar screen, there had been a small green mark and a man's calm voice. And then nothing. He had believed it right to the end. And the belief is the cruelest part, because the Flaw had been holding its own for 17 years, waiting for a night like this one, and it never gave him any warning at all. We are holding our own. And then the lake closed over her and kept her, and keeps her still. If her last minutes stayed with you, subscribe, because there is always another great ship and another final hour waiting to be told. And after weighing all of it, tell me honestly which one you believe reached up for her that night: the hatches, the reef, the wave, or the hull itself. Say where in the world you are watching from, and I will read every reply.